Greetings, Vampire World. This is Father Sebastiaan here, Master Fangsmith of the Sabretooth Clan and Impresario of the Endless Night Vampire Ball. Today, we're going to talk about the different types of vampires in the vampire community. First on my list of types of vampires is the Fangdom. The Fangdom is the largest group. The Fangdom is kind of like the fandom. It includes Buffy fans, Twilight fans, True Blood fans, Anne Rice fans. The Fangdom is a very diverse place, and it's not really tied together in one group. However, there are people that just love everything vampire, and they collect things and have a whole bunch of variety of, bottles of vampire wine to, every possible book on vampires, be it fiction, fantasy, or reality. They collect everything. So that's the first type of person that's in the vampire community. The second type of person in the vampire community is what I call the scholars. They're kind of like Watchers from Buffy. And these are people like Catherine Ramsland, author of Piercing the Darkness. J. Gordon Melton, the author of the Vampire book. And he is one of the researchers of new religious groups and found vampirism to be a very interesting subject. There's also people like Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who wrote the book Vampires Among Us. So that's a second type of person in the vampire community. Scholars are Elizabeth Miller of the Vampire Empire of the Count Dracula Society, right over here on Union Square, down the street from the Fang Shop. These people love the mythology, they love the study, the new trends of vampirism that are out there, and they're very much the people that write the books from an observer's perspective and a scholarly perspective. Now, the third type of person in the vampire community is the vampire with a Y. And these people are fashionistas or fashionistas. They're not role players, but they're not vampire. They don't believe themselves to be real vampires. It's more of a lifestyle for them. So a lot of people call them lifestylers. And lifestylers are a very big group. They're most of my Fang clients. They're cool people. They just love dressing up as vampires, incorporating the vampire mythology into their life in various aspects. Maybe getting bite marks on their neck and fangs, getting custom fangs, going to a vampire ball, dressing up. But they don't think that they need to drink blood, and they don't necessarily consider themselves any other type of vampire. The next type of vampire in the vampire community is the roleplayers, or live-action roleplayers, who play what we call LARP. Live-action roleplay is a wonderful thing because it's like an interactive theater or a murder mystery. Now, Vampire the Masquerade is the game. This is a game about vampires pretending to be humans, pretending to be vampires, pretending to be humans, kind of like Anne Rice's Vampire Theater. Vampire the Masquerade started in around 1992 and became a role-playing game that changed the game. In Vampire the Masquerade, there's a vampire government called the Camarilla, which has basically principalities around the world, with each city ruled by a prince. And they have a council called the Primogen, and they each come from one of the various vampire clans. Now, in Vampire the Masquerade, you have different clans. So you have the Ventru, which are the noble vampires. You have the Tremere, which are the sorcerers. You have the Malkavians, which are crazy. You have the Bruja, which are warriors. You have the Gangrel, which are the forest kind of hippie vampires, and so on and so on. There's 7 major clans, 13 in total. But vampires in Vampire the Masquerade have one of the greatest mythologies in vampire history. In the vampire world, this mythology is huge. There's dozens, maybe hundreds of books on Vampire the Masquerade with a whole mythology that traces itself back into the mists of time. In Vampire the Masquerade, you have all these different game mechanics and rules. And in the early 90s, besides zines and organizations like the Temple of the Vampire and the Order of the Vampire, this is where people in the vampire community would meet. They would use the game as kind of a networking experience. The live-action games came from the tabletop role-playing game, where you actually act out your character with a costume in a theatrical environment, usually in a theater or a private environment such as a nightclub. And in Vampire the Masquerade, the mythology also talks about the werewolves, which are the enemies of the vampires. And this is where we see an underworld where vampires are the enemies of werewolves. And that was actually a pretty interesting story because there was an actual lawsuit about that. I don't really know the whole details, but it's a really interesting piece of vampire history. Now, in the vampire community, role players are their own subset. Kind of like the RVC, the Sangs and Sais have their world, the role players have theirs. Vampire role players do not think they're really vampires. They love to play a theater. They're really fun. They interact together, and they act out the story in a theatrical way. So Vampire the Masquerade is a really great role-playing game. You can check it out, Vampire the Masquerade, at white-wolf.com. And there's also the live action game you can see on bynightstudios.com. So check it out. That is one of the largest and most interesting groups in the vampire community. The next type of category is the living vampire. And living vampires are occultist vampires. They believe in vampirism as a philosophy to achieve immortality. And there's a whole variety of them, from the TOV to the Order of Strigavai to the Order of the Vampire to the Order of the Black Dragon. Some are more left-hand path, dark, because they believe that primal nature needs to be embraced to achieve immortality. And some believe in breaking the cycle of reincarnation, while others believe in defeating death. So there's a philosophical side to that, and then there is a magical side to that, which is often called the day side, which is the philosophical, and the night side, which is the magical. And the living vampires are a extremely diverse group, but they're very secretive, and they don't really interact publicly with the rest of the vampire community. So that's a living vampire. They're on the quest for immortality, the preservation of the consciousness and the self, and improving their day-to-day lives through a system of vampire philosophy and technology. The next are the Black Swans. Black Swans are individuals who love the vampire lifestyle or the vampire culture. They're usually attached to living vampires, they're attached to RV vampires, and they're also attached to vampire lifestylers. They don't identify as a vampire, but they like being around the vampire culture. They can be lovers, friends, amigos, parents that are like, oh yeah, that's cool, you love your vampires, let's go to the vampire club. For example, at Long Black Veil, our original vampire club in New York, we used to have an opportunity where moms could come in and get their fangs in the afternoon for Mother's Day and then go to the club later. That was an example of a black swan. My mom is a black swan. She loves what I do, she knows all about it, but she doesn't identify as a lifestyle vampire, even though she has fangs. Now, the final two categories, which I'm going to bring up, are kind of diverse. There's a whole variety of different versions, but it's the psychic vampires and the sanguine vampires. The psychic vampires come in two categories. However, only one of them is a part of what I call the RVC, or people who think they're real vampires, the real vampire community. This is a subset of the VC, of the vampire community. A lot of times they identify as the whole vampire community, but they tend to look down on role players and lifestylers. However, there's lots of cool people in this group. First is the psychic vampire. Okay, and I like to categorize them in two categories. And as I said, only one of them is a part of the RVC. The first psychic vampire is what I call a traditional psychic vampire. They're absolutely horrible people that just make you feel bad. This is what you mean by a psy-vamp. When we talk about it in mainstream psychological culture. Usually there's nothing esoteric about them. When they come into your presence, you feel negative. They make you feel needy. They make you feel horrible. Like, for example, a good example of a psy-vamp, a traditional psy-vamp, is that woman in a nursing home that none of the nurses want to go into her room because she's so bitter about life. And psychic vampires, the only way to deal with them is to absolutely avoid them. I'll get into another video on that, on the traditional psychic vampires later. Now, in the RVC, there is a group called the ethical psychic vampire. Now, the ethical psychic vampires are usually aware that they're a psy-vamp. They're awakened to it, and they go through various, they believe that they have an energy deficiency, a leaky chakra, a damaged esoteric system, and what's really important to be aware of is they are making an effort to be ethical about what they do. They try, even though they have a lot of symptoms of a traditional psychic vampire, if they don't have control of it, but their awakening process goes through that. So they're very different from a living vampire, which is an esoteric system, and a psychic vampire usually deals with emotional energy, but ethical psychic vampires deal with kind of like life force, trying to equalize their mental, spiritual, and physical health through the concept of energy exchange with other people. And finally, what you've been waiting for, probably the most publicly identified concept of a vampire, is blood drinkers, known as sanguinarians. Now, sanguinarians are actually a very small subset of the community and actually have their own network. And sanguinarians are people that believe that they need to drink blood for mental, physical, and spiritual health, or that they get life force from it. It's extremely dangerous. And Sabretooth and my business, we don't promote, endorse, or communicate how to do blood drinking, because I'm a dental technician. I have to be very careful with sanitary work. I got to make sure that I am clean, and blood drinking is not something you do with fangs. There are several resource groups for that on the internet. You can just type in Sanguinarian, and a Sanguinarian means blood. Sanguine means blood in Latin, or sang. Sanguinarian means the ability to, I guess, to drink blood. Now, what's really important to realize is that a lot of Sanguinarians are very discreet about what they are. They're very taboo in a lot of circles, but they do draw a lot of media attention around, especially around Halloween. So they are not the majority of the vampire community. They are a presence. It's very, very dangerous to do this because there's a lot of new STDs and bloodborne diseases that come out every year. It's very risky. You can cause physical harm to someone if you don't know what you're doing. If you're not a phlebotomist or a nurse or a doctor, in some places it's illegal to take blood from the physical body, and it's very hard to do safely, not only for the reasons of disease and legality, but it's also very difficult to do because you can hurt someone if you don't know what you're doing, and it can be considered assault. So be very careful, make sure that you're educated on what it's about, and make sure that you only do it in a monogamous couple, because you can be HIV positive in some cases and contagious for up to 10 years. So that is my definitions of the vampire, types of people in the vampire community. Some people may agree with me, some people may disagree with me, but those are from my experience. What type of vampire are you? Put it in the comments below. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. And as always, thank you for watching. Do support by subscribing. This is Father Sebastiaan, and thank you, Vampire World.